Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. This is Left Side of the Aisle. I'm Larry Erickson, your host. And for the next half hour, I'm going to be talking about some things that, well, I think are worthy of your attention. If you have any reactions to the show, you certainly can send them to me directly. My personal email is whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. Or you can go to my website, which is called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL will be here several times during the show. You can get the email address from there, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather. If you do send me email, as always, I have just two requests. One is to include something in the subject line to make it clear this is about the show, it's not spam, and be patient about getting an answer because I really stink at answering email. So, with that, show's going to be a little bit different this week. Those of you that watch the show regularly, and I know there's a few of you that do anyway, may have noticed that I tend to have very extensive notes with me, and that's because I don't want to say the show is scripted, because it's really not scripted, but I do have extensive notes because since I say the show is news and commentary, I want the news part to be accurate. I want the dates, the names, the places, all that stuff. I want it to be right. So I want to make sure I have that information in front of me. And I want to make sure that I cover what I want to cover and say what I want to say and do it in the allotted time that I have. So, yeah, it's kind of tightly done. At the same time, I have always admired those people who, with just a handful of notes, can sit down in front of a camera or a microphone and then just go on for an hour or longer and just like freewheel it for that time. It's a skill that I have never really mastered that well, but this week we're going to be doing something sort of approaching that because there's some things that I just want to say. Some things that I just feel strongly about, and I just want to talk about them. So I do have some notes, but not a lot. We'll see how this goes. I mean, it may work out great, or I may make a complete fool of myself. So we'll find out about that soon. Anyway, to start by referring to the fact that last week, I spoke some about what I call the shredding of the commons. And if you didn't catch last week, or if you've never heard me talk about this before, my concept of the commons is the idea of there being a shared societal space where the common interests of a society lie. It's those things, those notions that bind a society together. It's the common bonds and the mutual bonds among members of that society. So it makes a society instead of just a collection of isolated individuals who happen to be occupying roughly the same geographical area. Every society has its sense of the commons. It's what binds them together. And beyond that, more specifically, there's call it a socio-political sphere. This is the area where politically and socially all those in that society, they can contribute something. They can be involved in some way. It's available to them. And everyone can contribute. Everyone has a responsibility to contribute. And everyone has a responsibility not only to that, but to all the others in that same society and to the society as a whole. I've said on a couple of occasions that as Americans, we could perhaps sum up the notion in the phrase, "we the people." And I said last week that our commons has been under attack. And I've talked about this a number of times before, and that attack has come largely from, well, scratch largely, come exclusively from the right wing, which has sought to attack the commons as a means of advancing its own power, its own influence, its own control. One primary means of doing this that I've talked about is voter restrictions, voter ID laws, and the like, all of which ultimately have the impact of making it harder for groups of people who are more likely to vote a liberal way as opposed to a conservative way, making it harder for those people to vote at all. Which is why the primary impact of voter ID laws has been on minorities and the poor and students, groups that are more likely to vote in a liberal way. The idea is that if you can cut those people out of being able to vote, it increases the political power of the right wing, of the rich, of the elite, of the powerful in our society. Another way, again, in a similar way, attacks on affirmative action and similar programs are attacks on the idea of reducing social inequality, and with that, reducing economic inequality. Speaking of that, economic inequality, attacks on the rights of labor. I'm telling you, the unions of this country, the labor unions of this country, essentially created the middle class in this country. It's essentially a creation of the of the labor movement, and that movement has been under relentless attack for the last couple of decades. Anyway, and interestingly, it was just recently revealed that the middle class is no longer the majority in this country. It used to be that the middle class, as defined, like 61%. Over 60% of Americans were middle class. Now it's barely 50% because more people have gotten richer than that and more people have gotten poorer than that. We are separating into a two-class society, just rich and poor, and the middle class is starting to be hollowed out. And that has come at the same time in conjunction with the weakening of the labor movement in this country. So again, that is an attack on the commons. But one of the things that in these attacks on the commons, the right wing has unleashed certain forces in the country, which, I mean, they knew, they had to know. Yes, of course they knew that they were doing this. Forces like renewed racism, renewed xenophobia, renewed religious bigotry, making these seem now normalized. These are forces which the right wing still foolishly believes that it can control. And these forces are not just challenging, not just affecting the commons, they are shredding it. I also said last week, in terms of the commons being shredded, that could be illustrated. That shredding of the commons could be illustrated by a comparison of how we as a people reacted and how the media reacted to two recent mass killings. One of them took place in Colorado Springs on November 27th, the other in San Bernardino, California on December 2nd. In the former case, a man named Robert Deere walked into a Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs, Colorado, shot up the place, killed 3 people, wounded 9 others. Several more people would have died, except because of previous attacks on Planned Parenthood clinics. These clinics tend to have safe rooms where people can take shelter from an attack. After a 5-hour standoff and shootout with police, he was actually arrested, at which point he said, "No more baby parts," which is like transparently, it's a reference to those thoroughly debunked, thoroughly discredited, doctored videos claiming to show that Planned Parenthood was illegally profiting from the sale of fetal tissue, or as they would put it, baby parts. Shortly after that, his ex-wife, or I should say one of his ex-wives, there are 3 of them, but one of his ex-wives revealed that some years before this, that Deere had vandalized a Planned Parenthood clinic in South Carolina by putting glue in the locks of the doors, which was a popular tactic at the time. And police then learned that the morning of his attack on the clinic, Deere had asked for directions to the clinic. Okay? Despite all that, 2 weeks after his arrest, officials and the media still decline to suggest a motive. It wasn't until after his first court appearance when he shouted things like, "I'm a warrior for the babies," and "kill the babies, that's what Planned Parenthood does." That was only then that major media was willing to go so far as to say, quoting, "It now seems clear that Planned Parenthood, in fact, was his target and abortion was his focus." All right, compare that to the shootings in San Bernardino. As soon as the name of one of those shooters, Syed Farook, became known, the word terrorism was flung around like candy at Halloween. It was immediately assumed that he was a Muslim. Now, as it turned out, yes, he is a Muslim, as is his wife, Tashfeen Malik. But the point is, it wasn't known at the time. It was just assumed from his name before a single fact was known. We had speculation about the couple's background, their motives, with assumptions about Islamic terrorism running through all of it, again, before a single fact was known. Since San Bernardino, we've been subjected to constant headlines, to the latest breathless updates about it. We've had broadcasts of reporters picking through the couple's possessions in their apartment, holding things up and going like, "I wonder what this is," or "I wonder what they use this for." We've had fear-mongering headlines about how for the past year they've been going to a gun range, which got literally translated to, "They've been planning this attack for a full year." And as for motive, what was the motive? What do you mean was the motive? They're Muslim. Well, yes, they're Muslim, but what was the motive for this attack at this place at this time? Especially when training for a year, supposedly, for a surprise attack with massive firepower against an unarmed group of people in an enclosed space. Training for a year to do that seems like really massive over-preparation. So what was the actual motive? Well, I told you, they're Muslims. They want to kill us. It's completely clear. Being Muslim, that is the motive. And Robert Deere's motive? Well, we don't want to speculate. It looks like it might, maybe have something to do with abortion rights, but, who knows, really? And did anyone ask about Robert Deere's religion? Yes, some places did, actually. He's a Christian. He could fairly be called a radical Christian. But did anyone at any point even hint that his religion had something to do with his attack on Planned Parenthood? And the answer is nobody did. It probably didn't even cross their minds. What has been suggested instead is that this is just another unfortunate case of mental illness. House Speaker Paul Ranton said that mental illness is, quoting him, the common theme with these types of shootings. And the thing is, whenever the shooter at one of these events proves to be a white, right-wing Christian male who, according to the FBI, are responsible for the majority of mass killings, the majority of terrorist attacks in the United States, whenever it turns out to be a white, right-wing Christian male, comes the escape clause. Mentally ill, unbalanced, troubled, certainly not typical of whites or the right wing or Christians or males. I mean, it's not like being a Muslim killer makes you typical of all Muslims. And certainly, if you're a Muslim killer, you can't be mentally unbalanced. Well, of course, not being a Christian means you're mentally unbalanced in some way, but not in any way that would reduce your responsibility or reduce the degree to which you are typical of your entire religion. I'm going to take a break here, okay? Let me just take a break. And we're back. And again, what I was talking about was the differing reactions to the shootings in Colorado Springs at Planned Parenthood and the mass murder in San Bernardino, California. The point here is that in our collective national consciousness, Syed Farook, who, by the way, is a native-born American, just in case you didn't know, Syed Farook and Tashfeen Malik they're not people. They become not people, but they're types, they're symbols, they're plaster casts, they're empty vessels into which we can cram all of our fears until those fears come oozing out of the eyes of our created monster, and we can convince ourselves that our hand-built, custom-designed monster actually represents a universal reality. Robert Deere, on the other hand, well, he's a white Christian male. He's not a type. He's a person, someone to be humanized, to be understood, to be at least pitied, if not sympathized with. 2 days after he murdered people at a Planned Parenthood clinic, the New York Times ran a portrayal of Robert Deere that called him a gentle loner in a piece that was titled, "Ex-Wife Recalls Colorado Gunman as Imperfect but a Good Man." And that piece opened with this sentence, and I'm going to quote it entirely and exactly. This is how it opened. "The blue eyes of Pamela Ross, 54, wince and cloud when she thinks back in the years that she spent with her ex-husband, Robert L. Deere, Jr." No eyes are allowed to wince and cloud over Syed Farouk or Tashfeen Malik. Acquaintances, colleagues, even family members are not allowed sadness or loss, only regret and sometimes surprise that they would do such a thing. Even as some darkly wonder why Farouk's father, who supposedly knew of his son's radicalization, didn't report him to authorities. While at the same time, no one wondered why none of Robert Deere's acquaintances and ex-wives notified the authorities about this gentle loner who, quote, occasionally unleashed violent acts toward neighbors and women he knew, and who believed that he was, because he was convinced, saved, that meant he could do whatever he wanted with no consequences. The San Bernardino massacre unleashed a new spike in attacks on Muslims and mosques in this country. It has even notoriously led to Donald the Rump's proposal to ban all Muslims from the United States from entering the United States, applying to immigrants, to tourists, even to American citizens who are Muslim who leave the country for some reason. They would not be allowed back in. Now, this idea has been condemned across the political spectrum, except appropriately enough by the white supremacists and the neo-Nazis who think it's really cool. It's been condemned across the political spectrum, but hasn't apparently hurt him politically. This is why. According to a new Washington Post ABC poll, December 14th, 36% of the American public approve of the Rump's proposal. 59% of Goppers agree with it. 38% of the American public agree with the statement that mainstream Islam encourages violence against non-Muslims. A Rasmussen poll released a couple of days earlier was, if anything, even worse. It had 46% of the public approving the Rump's plan, including 66% of likely voters in Republican presidential primaries. Conscious, deliberate discrimination on the basis of religion is now a seriously debated, widely accepted notion. Being a Muslim has become, in the minds of too many, if I can mix my religious metaphors here, being a Muslim in the minds of too many has become the mark of the beast. It's gotten so bad that a professor, a tenured professor at Wheaton College in Illinois, has been suspended because she said on her Facebook page that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. The statement that I thought was totally non-controversial, the statement that the Judeo-Christian God and Allah are the same being. But saying this was enough to get her suspended. Meanwhile, and this is something I won't even have time to really talk about this. I won't even really time to get into this because I've already gone on so long about this. Too many others in this country have found virtue in bedwetting fears of Syrian refugees hoping to escape war and tyranny. We are listening to people who want to be president of the United States declaiming that we can't let any Syrian refugees into the United States unless we can be, and it was said in so many words, 100% sure that none of those people is a terrorist. It was said in so many words that if 9,999 of these 10,000 people are great people, but one of them is an ISIS killer, then we have a serious problem. I find this astonishing and embarrassing. I truly do. We Americans, and here I'm referring to the great bulk of us, the great majority of us who are not Native Americans. We Americans, that great bulk of us, we are immigrants, children of immigrants, descended from immigrants. We pride ourselves on a history of daring. We dared to cross the oceans in search of better lives. We dared to strike out across the plains and deserts in search of new homes. We dared to step into space in search of a new frontier. But now we find logic. We find reason. We take pride in being cowards. Take pride in refusing to take any possible risk at all, even to 1 in 10,000. And in so doing, we turn our backs on part of what was the best of us. And our commons, the commons suffers yet another tear. By the way, as a quick sidebar, let me just throw this in here. If you want to understand Donald the Rump, just bear in mind one thing, and it all makes perfect sense. He's a real estate salesman. So say whatever pops in your head at a given moment that seems helpful. Make up whatever crap you think will help seal the deal, and say it with great assurance while insisting in the face of all fact, all logic, all contrary evidence that everything is wonderful, it's going to be great, and you're just going to love it. That's the Rump. All right, like I said, I already said I've gone on longer than I intended on this. I don't know how much more time I'll have to talk about anything else now, because I still have to say this. Last week, I mentioned that I have on a number of occasions said that there are times when I do not regret I will not live to see the world I see coming. And last week I said that now my fear is I will live to see that world. But at the same time, I have a consolation that keeps my spirits up, keeps my hope alive. The fact is, we as a people have been through times like this before. We have been through worse times than this before. And I'm not even thinking as far back as the Civil War, but just maybe 120, 130 years from the tail end of the 1800s into the 20th century. We have been through times like this. We have been through worse times like this, and we managed to survive as a people. The commons was stressed, it was strained, it was torqued, it was twisted, but we managed to keep it intact and in some ways improve it and expand it and strengthen it. But the fact is that it often appears that xenophobia is as American as apple pie. Because Muslim immigrants and Syrian refugees, they're not the first to face waves of paranoia, bigotry, and discrimination. It is not, in fact, it hasn't only been immigrants and refugees who have faced that. From the latter part of the 1800s into the beginning of the 1900s, there was a wave of immigration from Europe into the United States, which led not only to ethnic discrimination and racism against Irish, against Italians, against Poles, but an unreasoning dread that hidden among these waves of immigrants were cadres of Bolsheviks or bomb-throwing anarchists. Sound familiar? And it led to, again, sound familiar, a powerful backlash against immigrants, including the now famous Palmer raids by then Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, who rounded up suspected radicals with the intention of deporting them, and in the course of this went around burning books. In those years of the early 1920s, Congress twice passed strict new limits on immigration, slapping away those hoping to escape a continent devastated by World War I. In the 1940s came the infamous internment camps for Japanese Americans. Now, some German nationals and some Italian nationals who were living in the U.S. at the time were also interned, but in the case of the Japanese, 62% of them were American citizens. Well, there was the McCarthy era of the 1950s, which turned anti-communist paranoia into a national pastime, which still affects and infects our political discourse today. And in the past decade, we've had undocumented workers, particularly from Mexico and Latin America, who have been accused of everything from stealing American jobs to being drug couriers, violent criminals, and rapists, or all three. So yes, we have been here before, and at times it has been even worse. So yes, it's still a dark time. It is a dark time. But strains on the commons are nothing new, and even attacks on the commons are nothing. In fact, it's probably true that down through history, the elite of every society has sought to define the commons in the terms that includes just them and those they favor, and cuts everyone else out of that shared community. But we the people, we as a people, we can survive as a people. And if we, and here, by here, in this case, by we, here, if we, in this case, I mean right here, I mean we progressives, we radicals, we everybody that wants to build a national polity, a national community based on hope and inclusiveness rather than fear and exclusion. If we, to put a twist on Dylan Thomas, rage against the dying of the light, we may yet find that this dark time is what comes before the dawn rather than the close of day. So my advice to you is don't give up, and don't let me make you give up, because my woeful words are just not that important. I have not left myself enough time to talk about anything else. The other big thing I was going to talk about, actually, which I'll mention very quickly now, was global warming, the recently concluded Paris conference on global warming, which has been called historic and all these other wonderful adjectives. But what I noted most about it is that there's no binding agreements. There's promises. Just no binding agreement. The whole idea of this was to come up with a binding agreement that nations actually had to pledge themselves. But now, probably largely as the result of the reactionaries in our own Congress who made it clear that no treaty would ever pass, there is no binding agreement at all. And everybody's being talking about, oh, what great about all these pledges that nations are making. But what it really means is the countries of the world have given up on the idea of a binding agreement to fight global warming. And we have to now depend on just good intentions. I am not encouraged. That's it for this week. I guess I am really out of time now. So I will leave you with that and just say that, as always, you have the best week you possibly can. We will see you next week. Peace.